She planted trees nobody wanted her to touch. 5 years later, the soil beneath them was worth more than the farm itself. But the frost came early that year, and threatened everything. The morning Claire walked the back 40 with that old deed in her jacket pocket, nobody in the village thought much of it. The parchment was dated 1947, edges soft as cloth from being folded and unfolded too many times. Her grandfather had kept it tucked behind the bookcase in the cottage, and he'd never once mentioned what it meant. The land itself looked worthless. 12 acres of overgrown scrubland, half buried under bracken and bramble, with 5 ancient oak trees scattered across the slope like old bones someone had forgotten to bury. The village called it dead land. The agricultural consultants called it economically unviable. Her own sister called it wasteful the day Claire announced she was going to restore it. "You'll lose money for 10 years minimum," her sister had said over tea, stirring her cup with a kind of patience that meant she'd already decided Claire was wrong. "And for what? To prove you're different." Claire didn't answer. She folded the deed smaller and put it back in her pocket. What nobody knew, not yet, was that her grandfather had left something else besides the parchment. In the margin of a shipping manifest, tucked inside a leather journal she'd found only last month, he'd written 3 words, Truffle Oaks. 1943. The connection didn't make sense at first. Her grandfather had been a soldier, not a farmer. But the dates lined up. He'd been stationed in France near Périgord in 1943, in the chaos of the war. The oaks on the back 40 had been planted afterward, oddly spaced, deliberately placed. Not accident. Not neglect. Intent. That's what the deed meant. Her grandfather had come home and planted black truffle oaks on English soil when nobody was doing it, when it would have seemed mad. Then he'd kept quiet about it for 60 years. Claire was 42 years old and standing in a failing economy when she decided to finish what he'd started. The first person she told was James, the bank manager in the market town. She brought him a printed report, soil analysis, mycorrhizal inoculation data, market projections for Périgord black truffles in the UK. His office was all beige furniture and the kind of silence that comes before a no. 5-year minimum before first crop, he said, scanning the figures. Truffle cultivation isn't scalable. It's not secure. And Mrs. Collins, you're investing £40,000 of your own capital into land that hasn't been productive in decades. I'd need to see collateral against the farm itself. She felt her hand tighten on the chair arm, but she kept her face steady. The cottage. He looked at her over his glasses. You understand what you're risking. She understood perfectly. She was risking the house she'd lived in for 19 years. The place her daughter had grown up. The only thing separating her from the street if this failed. Yes, she said. The first year was just work. She cleared the bracken herself, hauling it into burn piles, scraping away decades of neglect. She brought in a soil specialist, a woman named Petra who'd trained in Burgundy and knew the smell of truffle-ready earth. Together they tested pH, amended the soil with lime and specific minerals, mapped the mycorrhizal networks beneath each oak. The 5 old oaks were perfect. Her grandfather had chosen well. But 5 oaks weren't enough for a viable operation. Claire needed at least 20 more, maybe 30, to create the density that truffle cultivation required. That meant £10,000 she didn't have for saplings and inoculation, plus 3 more years of care before those new trees would mature enough to support fungal growth. She took a second job at the heritage gardens in the village, working weekends and evenings for extra cash. It was there, watering the exhibition orchards, that Marcus noticed her. He was one of the other gardeners, early 60s, weathered, the kind of man who'd spent his whole life with soil under his fingernails. He watched her work for 3 weeks before he said anything. That's not the technique they teach you, he said one afternoon, watching how she was tending to a young apple tree. That's how my father used to do it. Long, slow soak. Most people rush. She told him about the truffle farm that evening. She'd drunk 2 glasses of wine and was tired enough not to care if he laughed. He didn't. Instead, he said, I know a man in Somerset who grows black truffles commercially. Started the same way, inherited oak from his grandfather, mad idea, everyone said so. I can call him if you want. She wanted. 2 weeks later, Claire's truck was loaded with 15 young truffle oaks from a Somerset grower, already inoculated with tuber melanosporum spores. The cost had eaten through her savings, money she'd been saving for her daughter's university fees. She didn't tell anyone that part. She planted them in early spring, each one placed with the precision of Petra's map, spaced exactly 8 meters apart. Marcus came and helped without asking for payment. He brought tools, his hands steady with the repetitive motion of someone who'd done this work his entire life. "Why are you helping?" she asked him once, on the second day, when they were both mud-covered and the light was fading. He was quiet for a moment, tamping soil around a sapling. "My father wanted to try this. In the 70s. Everyone told him it was madness. He was going to do it, but he got ill. Died before he could plant the first tree. I always wondered what it would have been like." He didn't say it like he wanted thanks. He said it like he was speaking to himself. The first failure came in August of that year. Too hot, too dry. 3 of the new saplings wilted and died despite the drip irrigation system she'd installed. The mycorrhizal fungi, which required a delicate balance of moisture and temperature, simply couldn't establish. She'd made an error in the drainage calculation, Petra told her gently. Easy mistake. Expensive lesson. Claire replanted them in September and didn't tell the bank manager. By the 3rd year, something remarkable happened. On a cold morning in November, when she was walking the perimeter with the truffle-hunting dog she'd trained herself, a Lagotto Romagnolo named Pearl, the dog suddenly went rigid beneath the oldest oak. Her nose moved in tight circles, then she pawed once, decisively, at the soil. The first truffle was small, barely 20 grams. Warty, dark, the color of old chocolate. It smelled like earth and rain and something deeper, something precious. Claire held it in her palm and felt something shift in her chest. It was real. It was possible. She photographed it, texted the image to Petra and Marcus, then sat on the cold ground with Pearl's head against her knee and let herself breathe. That was also the year Thomas Ashford arrived. He owned the industrial farm operation 3 miles south, a corporate leasehold on 400 acres of monoculture grains. He'd been buying up small properties for 5 years, consolidating land for mechanized harvesting. He came to see Claire in person one afternoon, walking up to the cottage in a suit that looked expensive and utterly wrong against the landscape. "Your property sits between 2 of my holdings," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Makes the operation fragmented. I'm prepared to make you a generous offer. Significantly above market value, given the condition of the land." He named a figure. It was more than she owed the bank. Not enough to account for what the land was becoming. "It's not for sale," she said. He smiled like she'd told a joke he didn't appreciate. "Everything's for sale at the right price. You'll think about it." He left a business card. She put it in the drawer with the takeaway menus she never used. The sabotage started in March of year 4. She found the fencing on the eastern boundary cut, 3 sections pulled down. The gates to the access road were open. At first she thought it was accident, until she noticed the boot prints, deliberate, methodical, stopping at specific points where tools would have been left. Someone had come, done a job, and left. The second time, they cut the irrigation lines to the new plantings. The third time, they simply left a note, "Reconsider the offer." She reported it to the police. The constable who came, a woman named Sarah who'd gone to school with Claire's daughter, spent an hour documenting, then sat in the kitchen with tea. "Could be anyone," Sarah said carefully. "Could be Ashford. Could be someone local who thinks he's helping him. Could be someone who resents you taking a risk others won't. Right now it's vandalism. If anything escalates." She didn't finish. Claire knew what she wasn't saying. If anything escalated, she'd have to prove it was Ashford, and proving things like that was expensive and uncertain. It was Marcus who noticed that James, the bank manager, had changed. He mentioned it carefully, one afternoon while they were installing new wire mesh to protect the young saplings from wild boar. "He's been talking about the farm. At the pub. Saying it's high risk, that you've overextended yourself." "He's right," Claire said, though hearing it hurt. "I have." "Yes," Marcus said. But he wasn't saying it like it was fact. He was saying it like he wanted other people to know. Like he wanted someone specific to know. She processed that. "Ashford. Maybe." She went back to the bank the next morning and asked to speak to James directly. He looked uncomfortable, which told her everything. "Your quarterly review is approaching," he said, not meeting her eyes. "The board has concerns about the viability of the truffle operation. We may need to reassess the terms of your loan. In other words, you're going to pressure me to accept Ashford's offer." He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. He just said, quietly, "I have a responsibility to the bank." She understood that too. Ashford probably owned a significant stake in the institution, or had connections to someone who did. In a small town, the connections between money and power weren't hidden, they were just polite. The frost came on the 23rd of April. Late frosts were rare but not impossible in the Cotswolds. This one came without warning, dropping the temperature to -8°C overnight. The truffle oaks, already budding for spring, couldn't survive it. By dawn, the new growth on all 35 saplings was blackened and dead. Claire stood in the field as the sun rose, feeling something like numbness. Not the oaks themselves, they would survive, their root systems intact. But the fruiting potential for that year gone. And the year after that, perhaps, if the damage was severe enough. She called Petra, who drove over within the hour. They walked the rows together, examining the damage. "It's not fatal," Petra said, and Claire heard the careful optimism in her voice, the tone you use when delivering bad news to someone who's already fragile. "They'll recover. It'll just set you back a season. A season. 12 months. Another year of paying the bank, of working weekends at the Heritage Gardens, of watching James's careful distance grow colder." But then something else happened. Petra made calls. To the Somerset grower. To a mycologist at Bristol University. To a restaurateur she knew in London who sourced from high-end farms. She didn't ask permission, she just did it. By that evening, Claire had 4 responses. The Somerset grower had frost damage too, was offering partial compensation through his insurance. The mycologist wanted to visit, was interested in documenting cold hardiness breeding for truffle oaks. The restaurateur wanted to reserve her next 5 years of production site unseen, and was prepared to pay a premium for early commitment. "You have something people want," Petra said, sitting in Claire's kitchen with a glass of water she hadn't been offered. "Everyone knows what you're trying to do here. The independent farmer, the impossible crop, the grandfather's secret. That's not a vulnerability. That's a story. That's something worth paying for." The regulatory inspection came 2 weeks later, routine, supposedly, but timed suspiciously close to the frost damage and the vandalism. The EU official who arrived was a man named Derek, with a clipboard and an attitude. He was looking for violations. Improper chemical use, unsustainable land management, failing to meet conservation standards. He didn't find them. What he found instead was the oldest oak, now in its 5th year of truffle production, with its canopy intact and its understory carefully managed for biodiversity. He found Pearl, the truffle dog, trained and healthy. He found detailed records of soil pH, mycorrhizal management, conservation payments, and, because Claire had finally connected the dots, her grandfather's original journal, with the 1943 planting notes written in his own hand. "This is exceptional," Derek said, and she heard surprise in his voice. "This level of documentation. And the heritage aspect, these oaks genuinely date back 70 years. 80, Claire said. "My grandfather planted them in 1943. He looked at the journal for a long time. "I'm going to recommend you for a heritage preservation grant," he said finally. "Have you applied?" She hadn't. She hadn't known it existed. 6 weeks later, she received notification of the grant, £8,000 toward the restoration of heritage farmland. The inspection report, published publicly as all EU inspections are, describe her operation as exemplary stewardship of ancestral agricultural heritage and a model for small-scale, sustainable truffle cultivation in Britain. The report was published in the Agricultural Review. It was picked up by a food blog, then a farming magazine, then a producer from a television documentary series about heritage farming. When Thomas Ashford's offer arrived again, 2 months later, it was significantly smaller. And there was a note: the industrial operation was consolidating elsewhere. The first full harvest came in late November of year 5. It wasn't huge, only 4 kilograms of Perigord black truffles from the whole operation. But at €600 per kilogram wholesale, €700 retail direct to restaurants, it was enough. More than enough. Enough to pay James back and clear the line of credit. Enough to stop working weekends at the Heritage Gardens. Enough to look Marcus in the eye and say, "Thank you." "Thank your grandfather," he said. But she was thanking both of them. The story became something bigger after that. Food writers came. Tourists started asking to visit. By year 7, she'd opened the farm to educational visits, teaching schoolchildren about mycorrhizal fungi and heritage agriculture. By year 9, she'd expanded to 45 oaks and trained 3 other truffle dogs. Last autumn, her yield was 18 kilograms. The income exceeded £12,000. The farm had its own brand. Michelin-starred restaurants in London reserved allocations months in advance. But the real payment came differently. It came when James, the bank manager, quietly retired. When he left, he'd transferred her loan to a different institution. The new manager took one look at the 5-year projections and doubled her credit line without hesitation. It came when the neighboring farmers, the ones who'd laughed, started asking her questions about soil management. It came when her daughter brought a friend home from university and said, quietly, "This is what my mum does. This is her farm," and the pride in her voice was something Claire had never heard before. And it came when Petra found something in the archive of old farming journals, a letter written by Claire's grandfather in 1948, never sent, addressed to his brother who'd stayed in France. In it, he'd written about planting the oaks, about waiting for the mycelial networks to establish, about patience. "I'm going to wait for this," he'd written. "As long as it takes. This is the real gift, not the truffles, but the proof that sometimes what everyone says is impossible is just something nobody's tried hard enough to believe in." Petra brought the letter to Claire on a Tuesday morning and left it on the kitchen table without a word. Claire read it once, then read it again. She thought about her grandfather waiting 70 years for her to understand what he'd started. She thought about Marcus seeing his father's work finish through someone else's hands. She thought about the weight of faith across generations. Then she went out to the field, where Pearl was already nose down in the soil, and got to work.